So thank you for inviting me to be the keynote speaker for your event. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Just some challenges here at home made it tough to travel at this point. But thanks for all the Zoom platforms and other technologies out there that makes it possible for us to share information. So you can see I'm representing more than a couple different hats: the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance and my firm Storm and Stream Solutions. And I'll give you some background on that. And we're starting a little bit early, which is great. Means that we can stay ahead of schedule, which is a good thing on a conference. I'll also note that I actually went to school. I grew up in Minneapolis and grew up in Minnesota, so the land of 10,000 lakes, or 13,000 really. So water's always been, and inland waters has really been a passion of mine growing up my whole life, whether it was going to the lakes, fishing, and then even in the wintertime, ice fishing or hockey, pond hockey, things like that. So I grew up there, but I went to school actually in Tennessee and in Memphis. So I spent a fair amount of time in places like Arkansas. I played baseball in college, so I got to travel around a lot of the South and have a lot of friends who ended up in Little Rock and other places like that. So I do have some connection to the area, and I can appreciate especially the natural beauty and the quality of the waters in Arkansas. And I know it's something that y'all want to help to protect. So I can have an appreciation for that. So I'm going to get going then, just to keep us on schedule. I assume everybody can see my screen. And again, if there's something, if you can't hear me, or if you're having a problem with my screen, please let me know. I'm going to talk about, first I'm going to give a background, the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance. Then I'm going to talk about exactly what I kind of laid out, where we've been, where we're going, where we are today, where we're going, and the role that the National Stormwater Alliance can play, and the role that you could play as professionals, I think, moving forward. So just real quickly, I only have a couple slides on this, but I did want to give some context where I'm coming from and what this organization is about. The National Municipal Stormwater Alliance is a coalition. It's not a individual member organization. It's a organization of organizations, primarily state stormwater organizations. And I'll show you who's involved with that right now. But the point is that way back, it's actually started in 2009 unofficially, and it's grown since then. We officially got our 501c3 a notification from the IRS, or approval from the IRS in 2018. So we're really new as an official organization, but we've been kind of unofficially around for a while. And it really happened because there was a federal rulemaking going on at the national level, and it was tough to get the stormwater folks at the table. And so we worked unofficially to try to put states together to make sure that stormwater is represented during that time. And it's just kind of grown since then. So the motivation really is to try to unite MS4s. We're the only national organization focused on the municipal separate storm sewer sector, the MS4 sector. There's a lot of national organizations: ASCE, Water Environment Federation, ASFPM, the floodplain managers. All of these groups touch on stormwater, but none focus specifically on MS4s. And there's 7,500 MS4s, and most of them are small and mid-sized, don't have great resources, and they're often left out of the conversation. We wanted to help to unify, connect these MS4s, provide a proactive voice, because oftentimes we've not been at the table during policy making and things like that. And we wanted to talk about stormwater as a resource and raise the image and the profile of stormwater as an issue, as a topic, and talk about the multiple benefits, multiple uses. And that's really ties in with the low impact development aspect or paradigm. And our vision is very simple. We want to help to provide clean water for the nation. Like many other organizations, we want to do this by helping MS4 programs and stormwater programs be effective, be efficient, and to use data and science and moving forward. So that's where we're coming from as our vision. We're active in all of these different areas: policy advocacy, education, technical information for stormwater organizations and programs. Messaging, communication. Again, we want to raise the awareness, but more right at the core of what we do, it's supporting MS4s. And we're at that. And I heard for previous speaker a little bit. I didn't hear all. I apologize. I'm in the Washington, D.C. area. Sounds like that gentleman's also in the Washington, D.C. area. One of the benefits of that is that, we can advocate at the national level for different topics. So that's where we're coming from. That's where we're active in. And you can see we've got 24 states. So we started in 2018 with about 5 states. Now we've got 24 states. We got half the country, more or less, over half of the population of the country. Arkansas is not part of our organization as of yet. Oklahoma is, I think, about to join. So we've got Louisiana, talked to Mississippi, Alabama. We helped to set up their organization, and Georgia is a leader for us. So the South is getting to be well represented. Tennessee and Kentucky have been on board since day one. So we'd love for an organization to step up to represent MS4s in the state. Just wanted to throw that out there. But we also have individual MS4s that have joined us. That's starting to happen. And then we have a bunch of affiliate members, corporate members, things like that. So just, again, letting you know where we're coming from. This is our leadership. I'm the executive director. We've got Scott Taylor from California, Randy Neprash from Minnesota, and James Moore from Georgia, who are in our leadership right now. Okay, so that's enough of that. Just wanted to give you a context of where I was coming from. So stormwater, where we've been, you got to set the table with this. And we've been doing this for a long time. I mean, literally hundreds or thousands of years. You can go back to, you can find examples in the Mediterranean area, in Rome, thousands of years ago. We've been pushing water around, right? And back in starting in the 1860s, mid 19th century, in major cities like London, we started to look at ways to do this in a more efficient way. So Manning's formula, things like that, all come from that era as well. He was, I think, Scottish person, if I remember right. So we've been doing this for a long time. More recently in this country, I wanted to highlight some milestones. Back in 1972, President Nixon created the Clean Water Act. Folks know that, I'm sure. But stormwater urban runoff was not part of that vision, was not included with that initial Clean Water Act. But that being said, even 6 years later, that's when the National Urban Runoff Program, or NURP program, starts, right? That's when we started to study what's actually in, what's the stuff that's in there that could be a problem. So due to the information from the NURP program, we actually, and as part of the 1987, it's one thing one of the last things that President Reagan did was to amend the Clean Water Act. Part of that amendment was to bring in and create the MS4 program. So stormwater enters in at that point. And the reason I want to highlight this is the fact that there's 2 reasons. First is we're pretty late to the game. We're a young sector, and that's got a lot of ramifications we'll talk about here. The other thing is to think about, and I've just done some back of the envelope estimation about how much land development and impervious cover and whatnot, how much of that happened before we even started regulating at the federal level. And just by the estimations going back to 1900 and before, I'm estimating is about 3/4 of the land that's out there that was developed before we even had a chance to start really doing something about it in a coordinated fashion. So that means that there's a lot of unregulated, unmanaged developed land out there. Just something to think about. So we move along phase 1 of those 600, 700 large communities. About a decade later, phase 2 starts. So that's the small and mid-sized communities. That's when we get another 6,500 or so communities that join. So that's when things really ramp up. A couple of things to note is that in 2008, there was a National Research Council, or National Academy of Science, National Research Councils under the National Academy of Science, did a report, a pretty intense report about the state of stormwater. And I've got some quotes from that as we'll go along, but that was a watershed type of, no pun intended, watershed type of a document, and it helped to initiate the federal stormwater rulemaking. I mentioned that was kind of the start of NAMSA. In wastewater, we've got a national rule, right? We've got all wastewater programs, all state programs have to comply with secondary treatment level. We don't have that in stormwater. And so back in 2009, they started looking at this as a possibility. 5 years later, by 2014, they deferred this. It was just challenging to do. They had other priorities in that administration. So that was deferred. So we don't have it at this point. But just, again, the most recent milestone is that And this year, March of this year, February of this year, ASCE's infrastructure report card for the first time ever includes stormwater. That's a big deal. I don't think that's a minor thing at all. So let's just kind of zoom out a little bit in the context of stormwater management. We're talking about I think of it as 4 phases. The first is just peak discharge. We really started looking at flood control, right? We really wanted to get a handle on that. I know I was part of the bridge scour program for Tennessee for TDOT back in the late 90s. And part of that was we saw just greater increases in flows overall, leading to impacts on infrastructure such as bridge scour, bridge failures, things like that. So we wanted to focus on peak discharge. That's a big deal. We still deal with that. But the next phase was, again, we had a recognition of that, hey, the stuff that's in the runoff itself is bad. So that's just kind of basic treatment of both quality, and we started to do continue the peak discharge treatment as well. Next level, we have enhanced, water quality, trying to get that first flush. So that's the next phase, and we're expanding our federal regulatory program we talked about. And then the next phase, and the phase we're in now, is really focusing on volume. This is where LID comes in. So again, this is still relatively new. So I just want to put this in the context of, where are we in terms of the whole evolution of this sector, and just the water sector and our sector specifically. So we're still learning. This is still a relatively new field, and we're still doing a lot of research, and we're learning quite a bit about green infrastructure, LID, whatever you want to call that. Okay, so again, take a quick step back. Traditional stormwater management, I think we've known this for a while. Again, we've been Romans for a long time. We generate runoff, we capture, we convey it, we try to do it as efficiently as possible. That's how I was taught in college. So that's really urban drainage, right? That's really what that's about. And you guys know all these practices. Trapezoidal concrete ditches to be as efficient as possible, with flows to get that off the site as quickly as possible, underground concrete ditches, ponds, and whatnot. And, they serve a good purpose. There's still thousands of them, and I'm in Fairfax County, Virginia. Right now we've got 5,000 ponds overall, at least that many. There's millions of ponds across the country. They do a great job, and they're a good thing, and they're still going to continue today. So this is not to say that green is good and traditional is bad. It's just that we need to look at both systems and see how they work together. But just trying to give some background here, some context here. So what we've ended up with having these very efficient systems is we have directly connected watersheds in our urban areas. That leads to really, really efficient pollutant delivery to our receiving waters, and it also leads to massive impacts to our headwater streams, geomorphology, and those type of things. And that's, it's not just places in highly urbanized areas. I know that there's a lot of great research going on in the northern Kentucky area. Some great researchers going in Louisville and University of Kentucky have focused on this in that area, which is urbanizing quite a bit. So it's not just New York City, it's not just Chicago. And in fact, a lot of it's in the suburbs and the exurbs of other areas, such as in Cincinnati and going into northern Kentucky. So we have these areas, and really, what does that give us the paradigm of for conventional stormwater or traditional stormwater management is to, let's put, pervious or impervious down surfaces for everything. Let's not think about anything else. Let's put curb and gutter everywhere. Let's control those flows, be as efficient as possible. Let's bypass the green areas. Sometimes we'll put a detention basin in there or something like that, and then let's just send it to the water body. There's a lot of opportunity missed there, and I think that's what we're talking about here in this approach, this LID approach. So that's where we've been. So where are we today? And I put this under the context of maturation of the sector, or putting on your big kid pants. We're starting to grow up is the point. And I grew up, and speaking of growing up, I grew up in a large Catholic family. Maybe that's redundant to say large Catholic, but and I was the youngest. Not only was I the youngest of 5 kids, I was the youngest of many, many cousins. So I was at the little kids table. There's always a Thanksgiving, which is coming up now. That's why I put this together. I had this in my mind. There's always the adults table. There are all the serious conversations going on, all the good china, all the good salt and pepper shaker. If you go to the kids table, it's this rickety thing. We're all in plastic chairs. We had, we didn't have the nice stuff. And all the good, important conversation was going on at the adults table, and the kids table we were just throwing food at each other, right? Having fun. And I was at the smallest, the youngest of all those tables, because we had so many kids with multiple tables. So maybe I'm just harboring this as an issue. But anyway, so the point is, stormwater's been at the kids table for a long time, since we've been going on. And everyone else has been at the adults table, or the big kids table, whatever you want to call it. And the point is, I think we're moving up from that kids table. We're graduating up to the adults table. And I'm going to try to share some information about why I think that's happening, why that's going to continue to happen as we move forward. So with that, kind of a data point to think about here is based upon an opinion piece that was written up by William Ruckelshaus. And I don't know if folks don't know that name. He was one of the architects of the Clean Water Act. He was in the Nixon administration. He was part of the Saturday Night Massacre and all that stuff, but he not only helped to architect the Clean Water Act, but he was the first DP administrator, and he was the only one. He was brought back in sometime in the 80s to stabilize the agency. He's the only person who's done that twice. He's served as administrator twice. So he just passed away, I think, a year or two ago. Just a pretty amazing guy. If you want to check out the history, his biography is an amazing guy. But anyway, in 2010, he was asked by the Wall Street Journal, how do things look in terms of environmental condition and where things are with waters? And he said, looking back over 40 years, that, and he called it the new shade of green. That was the title of this opinion piece. And he said back in 1970, most of our impairments, most of our problems came from traditional point sources, right? Wastewater, effluent discharges, industrial discharges, things like that. So that's that blue part of that pie chart. So 85%. The remaining part was the non-point source. And you could, back then, urban runoff was part of non-point. So agricultural runoff, urban runoff, things like that. But you fast forward 40 years. So this is written in 2010, remember? And he said, hey, we've done a great job. Things we've improved. And clearly, we're getting better when it comes to the amount of pollution and the condition of our waters. However, the distribution is exactly the opposite. Now, the dominant challenges for us are the non-point source. So we've had this focus on point source, traditional point source. Now we need to focus on non-point, or including urban runoff in that context. So so it means it's the water quality issue of our time today. It really is one of those things. Another part of this history, and that's tied to this too, is I'm sure people have seen this before. The fact that this is the Cuyahoga River, which was on fire. This is, I don't know which time this picture was taken from, to be honest. So this could be 1969, which was one of the more famous events, but it actually was on fire dozens of times over decades. So this wasn't a one-time event for those. So this is part of, I think, there's a lot of environmental history that's lost, frankly. A lot of folks don't realize this, but this was a commonplace thing. In fact, it happened so frequently that they got to be really good at putting out fires on their river. And I would say that that's a pretty good data point that you should do something about something when you get really good about putting out fires on your rivers. But these fires got to be huge, 5 stories high. They were very impactful. And this is one of those pictures that was ended up in Life or Time magazine, or one of those kind of magazines back when people read those kind of magazines at a major level. And it helped to drive, is a driver for change, helped to drive the environmental movement and creation of the EPA, right? So that's clearly compelling. That's just a smack yourself in the forehead. We got to do something about this. Then we looked at today with urban runoff. Is this as much of a compelling driver? And I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying that messaging wise, it's a lot easier to make the case here that we've got a problem and we need to make major investments and do something about this. And this is an urgency. This is a crisis. Runoff on a parking lot does not have that same urgency oftentimes, but we know as folks in this sector that this does have significant impacts. It's just harder to see it oftentimes. Now with catastrophic flooding, things like that, which we're seeing more and more, that does have that sense of urgency. And I think that's part of the driver, today, frankly. But the point is that it's not just the massive flooding. It's a localized flooding. It's the impacts to streams. It's the impact to biota, as we heard about from the first speaker. It's the impacts with our waters overall. We don't want to create sewers out of our rivers and streams, and that's kind of what's happening. I mean, urban runoff is considered the only growing source of water, major growing source of water pollution that's consistent across the country. Not everywhere all the time, but in a lot of places, a lot of the time. And it impacts, you know, we talked about flooding, ecological and health impacts. I'm, again, out on the East Coast now. Fish kills are not completely unusual along the East Coast here, and these dead zones, which are driven by all the nutrients that come down from, you know, I'm in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Chesapeake Bay has a lot of nutrient issues, right? In the summertime, late summertime, there's always a challenge with the dead zones that are growing and growing and growing, impacting fisheries and whatnot. So we have harmful algal blooms in inland areas. Lake Utah, in Utah, has had some problems with this in the inland context. Had some significant public health impacts. Go to Florida and hear what's going on there. Major problems with nutrients and algae. That's one of the biggest issues out there when it comes to water quality. But again, over half, a study from 2012 by EPA and USGS combined together found that over half of the stream miles don't support healthy aquatic biota. And again, this is why in a place like Arkansas, you've got so many healthy streams. I've gone out there to do stream assessment work, stream restoration, and it's beautiful. And that's a place where you want to protect and preserve that as much as possible, right? Because that can be impacted significantly and degraded significantly. We don't want those streams to fall into the category of not supporting healthy biota. We also have CSOs and other things like that are going on. So the point is that this is a major issue. It impacts a lot of areas, right? So you guys know this. You're in the field. So again, with traditional stormwater management, we've already talked about this. We collect, convey, detain, but now we're talking about this paradigm of green infrastructure, where we use the terms like infiltration and retention. So now we're making this change, making this leap now. And the big takeaway there is that we're looking at stormwater as a potential opportunity and as a resource, not necessarily and only as a burden. Obviously, it's a challenge that needs to be addressed, but it's also something that we can, as we treat, as we manage, as we convey, as we manage it overall, just in a large picture, we can do things such as improve our property values. We can do treatment and conveyance at the same time. We can reduce the amount of overall runoff that's generated. So over here on the far right side, or in the middle of this far right picture here, there's a Target parking lot. You can see we've got a lot of permeable asphalt, or porous asphalt in this one area, and the other area has the impervious version, and you can see the difference here. So we're having more technologies that are helping us make this shift. But this is a major change, and this, when you see something as a resource, as an opportunity, you can convince communities and investors to make investments, frankly, in stormwater. And I do want to, just a quick sidelight here. I know that you guys are using the term low impact development. I've got the term green infrastructure here. There's also green stormwater infrastructure that we hear quite a bit. Natural and nature-based features. That's something that we hear more in the coastal context from the Corps of Engineers. We're now hearing the term nature-based solutions from NOAA and others. I just want to throw that all in here. I'm not trying to get into the weeds with these things at all. I just think that a lot of these are just talking about using natural processes to the degree possible, right, to try to get water into the ground, to restore hydrologic balances, and as well as get treatment, So I wouldn't get hung up about the name, low impact development, green infrastructure. I see those as almost completely synonymous. I just want to throw that out there so that if I'm using a term that's different than what you're using, I think they're very similar, if not exactly the same, in the context, especially of stormwater management. So the great value here is that stormwater, that green stormwater infrastructure, especially green infrastructure, low impact development, not only can manage issues, so it's multi-beneficial, and this is kind of what we're talking about with for NAMSA and our regional vision, was the fact that we wanted to highlight the fact that we're not just seen as conveyances and sewers and things like that. We can actually make benefits happen in the social context, in the economic context, and the aesthetic context. And those are not minor at all. In fact, those are things that politicians and planners and others, they'll see those first, not as scientists and engineers, potentially. But there's ways to beautify our neighborhoods, there's, you can see again, this in the middle picture up here. Again, there's a porous section and an impervious section for this. This is a basketball court in the city of Philadelphia. One benefit that they found out they didn't even realize is the fact that it's quieter when you have basketball played on porous asphalt. It actually dampens the sound. So not only do you get less runoff, you can dampen sound. These are minor things, of course, but you add up and stack and layer all of these benefits together. Reduced urban heat island effect, all the stuff that I think that you guys probably already know. You might think of in any one of those might seem like they're minor, but if you add them all up, they become very significant, especially as they go beyond the fact that we're just not going to treat runoff. We're going to do all these other beneficial things. So that's the real value. And one thing I wanted to mention here is, I mean, there's so much focus right now, rightly so, on environmental justice issues, and this is just some basic. I gave a talk recently on this, so I wanted to share some of what I found on the lack of green space in minority areas, in areas with high poverty, and there's health impacts associated with that. There's air quality impacts associated with that, and even places where we have high poverty rates and high concentrations of minority communities, and you do have green space. There's often social access issues, not good pedestrian walkways, high crime that makes it difficult to go from here to there safely. There's toxics in the environment. All of these things are real things, and we're starting to see a change this area. So this is the point is that stormwater is not just good, and green infrastructure, I should say. Green infrastructure is not, and then low impact development, not just good for managing things, not for just good for public health or whatever, but it's good to help address issues and challenges that are frankly out there that we're dealing with in a more holistic way, socially, politically, whatever we want to say. And I'm not trying to get into politics here, but this is just a reality of what's going on today. And this doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. This is something that benefits many and all at the same time. So that's a whole other talk. I'm not going to get into the deeper issues related to that. I just wanted to mention that. I think it's an important thing, especially today in the focus. What's going on with the infrastructure bill has a lot of focus on not just minority areas, but areas that are marginalized. A lot of rural areas that have been, frankly, forgotten and neglected. Green infrastructure and low impact development really can be a positive tool to attract economic development in those areas as well. Okay, so I'm going to switch now to talk about the sector needs. So as I'm thinking about as a stormwater manager, as an MS4 program manager, something like that, what are our needs? And I've got it broken down into 5 different areas. I'm not going to talk about funding. That's the thing that everyone talks about. We all need more money. I need more money. We all need more money. But programs, and especially in stormwater, will need more money. I'm going to talk more about that in my talk tomorrow afternoon. So I'm not going to get into that too much here. But I do want to talk about these other issues at this point. And one, it was told in my bio, and I'll mention it here again, that I worked at the Water Environment Federation, WEF, worked there for 5 years, helped them set up their stormwater program, and they now have a Stormwater Institute, which is great. We partner with them, our organization partners with them, and one of the things that we partnered on is what's called the MS4 Needs Assessment Survey. This is the only time there's been a statistically significant survey of stormwater programs across the country. 48 states, communities of 5,000 up to 5 million, frankly. I mean, like literally that wide spectrum. So it goes across the country, all sizes, all regions, all areas. So it's a significant effort. It's a great thing for us to know. We can learn so much about what the needs are in the sector through these types of efforts. So it's great leadership that WEF has shown there. There's a link there, and I think the PDF is available as well for this of this talk. You can go to that link there and you can learn more about that. You can read the report. And I help to do the analysis and the report writing. If you have any questions, you can ask me. But we also have a dashboard. You can go to the dashboard and click on it. It doesn't go down to the state level. It goes to the EPA region level. So you can go to the region and see how does your region differ from other regions or across the nation. So anyway, the point is that there are 2 major things that we're focused on in 2018 and 2020. There's going to be one coming up in 2022, I do want to mention that so that folks are, if you see an email or an announcement about this, please get involved. The more data we get, the better this is going to be overall. But the two major areas are to just what are the challenges and needs in the MS4 sector, and then we also want to get an understanding of the current amount of investment, what are the budgets, and then the funding gap. I'll get into the funding gap and budget, like I said, in my talk tomorrow. But one of the big takeaways, and there's a lot more information than what's shown here, and it's hard to see this, especially where you're sitting. So I'll just highlight a couple things. One of the big questions was, and there was 20 questions or more. So this is just kind of everything boiled down. We looked at phase 1s, phase 2s, so large and small programs, non-traditional phase 2s, so universities, not just communities, and state DOTs. So they're all part of this. We separated our results out by that. But the big takeaway here is that the three top areas of needs, or challenges, I should say. I'm sorry, challenges. Whereas aging infrastructure is number one. Number two, funding and availability of capital for investment, which is, that's a consistent thing. And then regulations, which is not surprising. But you can see that there's a pretty significant difference between the regulations and aging infrastructure. This means that we're starting to see, we're starting to mature. Again, I talked about the sector maturation is one of the themes here. Are these ponds that have been built in the 80s maybe are starting to get, towards their lifespan, and a lot of drainage systems are failing. So aging infrastructure is starting to begin. This is the first time in 2018, the top issue was funding. Now the top issue is aging infrastructure. And I think we're going to see that more and more. So that's just a data point that's worth noting. And also I've highlighted here that different sectors, even within the stormwater sector, DOTs have different challenges than large communities, and they have different needs than mid-sized and small communities. But what we're showing here is kind of the overall picture of what the challenges are. So aging infrastructure, that's just something to put away as a real challenge that's going on right now, and a growing challenge, I think. I mentioned this earlier, but I just want to mention it again. This is one of the most significant things. WEF and NAMSA, my organization, we work together basically to get ASC to think about including stormwater. They had, in their infrastructure report card, I assume everyone's, or most of you have heard of the infrastructure report card. If you've not heard of this, then check it out. But it's been around for a long time. It's got a lot of credibility. It's something that we can use at the national level to advocate. Hey, look, we have a grade of D. Actually, that's what they found out. The first grade that we got was D. Not surprising, right? But these other sectors that have different grades, it's very helpful for me and my organization and others to be able to go to our Congress members or to others and say, look, we're in bad shape. We need investment. We need support. And that support can be financial. It can be other things too, flexible regulations and other types of things like that. So this is a major data point. This just happened this year. Like I said, we've been working with WEF and ASC for at least 2 to 3 years to get this to happen. ASC wanted to do this for a while. They just didn't have that data. So WEF and that survey I just showed you helped to give the data that ASC could use to move forward. So this is going to move forward as we go along from here. So again, this is just another data point that we are starting to arrive at the adult stable or big kids stable, however we want to note it. There's a need for data standardization. It's not very fun or sexy, but it's something that needs to happen as part of the sector maturation, right? We're starting to see GIS data standards. Esri, who I'm guessing again that most of you know about Esri and GIS, Geospatial Information Systems. They're now starting to developing standards. Hopefully we'll see more standardization and adoption of data standards. So as a national organization, we can collect this information and we can say, hey, we've got 5 million stormwater BMPs across the country and they're in this condition. Right now we can't do that. And it really makes it harder for us to advocate for more support unless we kind of do our own work, our own due diligence. And I can compare that with the transportation sector. They've got the National Bridge Inventory. We know there's, I think it's 40,000 plus bridges around the country. It's updated every month. All bridges across the country are named in a similar way, whether it's in Alaska or down in Florida. They have similar nomenclature, so they're all in the same database. The condition is up, information. The conditions are updated on a regular basis. So there's a lot of consistency in the data reporting there that helps them say, hey, look, we've got 40,000 plus bridges out there. 30,000 of them are in bad shape. So we need to do something about it. That helps the transportation sector say, hey, look, we need some support. So that's helpful. And that's what I'm talking about with asset standards too, our assets, our drainage infrastructure, our DMPs. That's what we're talking about. So I think we're seeing more data standardization starting to happen. Another big push for this is going to be the e-reporting rule. I don't know if folks have heard about this. Is the electronic reporting rule that's going on right now. By 2025, by the end of the year of 2025, December 21st, I think is the date, all permit information has to be submitted via electronic data. That's not just scans of reports. That's not PDFs. That's data elements in a data field in a spreadsheet. So that so you can see on the right here that EPA gets and state regulators get these huge stacks of reports, and it's hard to go through that data to understand where things are. It's hard to analyze that data. So this effort is now focused on making sure that we can get information in a form that can be analyzed by regulators, so that they can follow up on non-compliance, but also work to understand where they need to make some adjustments to help move forward with our sector. This is a big deal. We're working with EPA and with communities to try to make sure that this is a smooth transition. But something that's out there, so data standardization is something that's part of this maturation that we're going through. And I think one of the challenges too is that we're a relatively new program. 1990 was the first promulgation of the first federal stormwater regulations. So one of the questions that came up in this survey, going back to that WEF survey, was, do you think that the federal stormwater program is sufficient in meeting clean water goals in long term? And you can see just right across the top here, it's about a third, more or less, plus or minus. Yes, no, and unsure. That's the definition of lack of consensus and agreement, right? This is, I don't think, what we want to see if we want to feel like we're confident that what we're doing or what we have been doing is the right thing to do. So now we're coming about 30 years for this program. And now it's time to start thinking about what can we do differently? What changes do we need to make? And I think that's part of this maturation. And that doesn't necessarily mean more regulations. It could mean smarter regulations. It means maybe we measure more and adapt more. And that's part of what we're trying to look at, and is trying to use more data and information out there. There's ways to get through sensors and other types of things. We can collect data in a better way than we have in 5 years compared to 5 years ago, or 10 years ago. Battery life and remote sensing, all of those things make this much more possible than it has been, and make monitoring. It's still not cheap, but it's cheaper, and it's something that's more reasonable to do. If we don't, I think about Peter Drucker, those who are kind of business minded or management minded. Peter Drucker was one of those gurus and said, you can't manage what you can't measure. I think we need to start measuring so we can make adjustments, because if we're going to make millions or billions of dollars in investment in stormwater, and I think climate change and other things that are happening we're seeing that happen right now. That's only going to continue to be a driver, right? And we're going to have to say, hey, what we're putting in the ground actually performs. We know it's worth doing, and we know why. We can measure it, and we can say, why would we build any other infrastructure and not measure it and not see that if it performs or not? No one would want that, and no one expects that. And we need to start changing our mindset when it comes to this. To me, this helps to kind of calcify the idea that we need to do something about this in our program. We need to make some changes. Okay, so where are we going in the future? So this is the where we've been, where we are today, and where we're going in the future. And what I think about looking into the crystal ball into the future, I think about the question of tipping points. There's growth that happens oftentimes. Things they grow slowly, and they hit some nick point, and then they accelerate, and then they eventually mature, and the growth kind of flattens out and maintains. So the question is, there's that tipping point where you go from introduction to growth on this graph, and you see this in business, you see this in all sorts of places, right? So the question is, where are we along this continuum? Are we at that tipping point? Are we beyond that tipping point? People might have different answers and thoughts on that. One phrase I heard once, not too long ago, was somebody made the statement in a meeting, stormwater is today where wastewater was in the 1960s. I tend to think that that's the case. If that's the case, then I think it's probably, we're not at that tipping point yet, because a lot of growth and maturity has happened in the wastewater sector after the 60s. But you know, we're all in different places. I've got a child, and he often gives me that bored look about, you know, we're driving, you know, a long distance. Are we there yet? Are we at that tipping point? What's the metric? Is it how much money we've spent? Is it how many BMPs we've put in the ground? Is it how much land has been managed through stormwater management or not? I don't know. It depends on who you are. It depends how you look at it. We can think about urbanization, which is what I'm showing here. A lot of different patterns in urbanization. So a lot of graphs here. So in the upper left-hand corner, we can see that the difference between rural and urban population growth. I mean, in North America, we've been urban for a long time, right? So that's just continuing and continuing and continuing, more or less in a pretty consistent pattern. Rural areas are declining in terms of population, right? That's true, but we're talking about suburbs and exurbs. There's a continuum here, and that drives our sector. What type of development happens dictates what kind of management we need to provide for stormwater management. So this is information, this middle graph here is information from the Brookings Institution, looking at growth, population growth for between 2000 and 2010, and then after from 2010 to 2011. So basically this is looking at the great housing crisis, right? In 2008, 2009, what happened there? What was the reaction? Well, prior to that time, we saw a lot of growth in the suburbs, significant growth in the suburbs. After that happened, we saw actually more growth in urban primary downtown areas. Now we look at, since that time, and we look at, this is the far right side, this is from Pew Research. We're actually seeing, if you take a broader view of things, more growth overall in large suburban areas, so exurban areas. That means more greenfield development, right? More new development, not just infill and redevelopment. And you can, you know, towards that end, we can see the USGS released a report looking at different types of urbanization patterns. And they had a projection, this kind of super, you know, between like Charlotte and Atlanta, this corridor is growing significantly. They expect an increase by 190%. That's significant. That's going to be primarily new development. You know, we think about where I'm in DC, all the way to Baltimore is one of the, or up to Boston is one of those urban corridors. But a lot of that growth's already happened. Other areas are starting to grow. So it's urbanization is not the same everywhere all the time. That's kind of the big point I'm trying to make here. So I did want to talk about what's going on in Arkansas specifically, and we can see that up in Northwest Arkansas, where you guys are focused on right now, this seems to be the area that has the most growth in the state, right? We see population changes are 150% in some parts of Fayetteville and other areas around. That's, so again, just like urbanization is not the same everywhere all the time, spatially across the country, or the types of urbanization. Same thing within a state. A whole state might not be dynamic when it comes to urbanization, but some parts of it are. And that's what we're seeing up there. So I understand, and I applaud the fact that you guys are looking at trying to make some changes when it comes to how you're addressing runoff management as you're growing so much. This kind of reminds me of what has gone on in Montana. Montana has actually had a couple of stormwater conferences because they want to preserve their water, their waters as much as they can from urbanization, and they're growing exponentially in Montana right now. So again, these are all things that we need to think about. Are we at the tipping point in Northwest Arkansas? Probably not. In other areas, we might be closer to that tipping point when it comes to investment in stormwater and the evolution, the maturation of stormwater. So one of the, and I mentioned this before, and I want to mention it again, is the fact that we have close to, you know, we've got about 1 million acres of developed land per year. So 800,000 to 1 million acres of land is developed every year. We've got about 100 million acres of developed land that exists right now. It's about 5% of the total land area, about 2% of the total land area, or about, what is that, 40% or so of the total of the developed area is impervious. So if you take all the imperviousness, you can squish it down into about the state of Ohio. So you might say, well, why is that such a big deal? It's because that's where we live, right? And that's obviously, we can't just pave Ohio and everyone else lives out somewhere else. It's not how it works. But because it's all obviously spread around. So while we might have our imperviousness and our footprint of development might seem small, again, we develop where we live. We make it pervious where we are and where we live. And again, back to the envelope, my calculations were, and I think this is true, that 3/4 of the development's already occurred. So most of that development happened before we started managing it. So that means that we've got a lot of imperviousness and a lot of development that's out there not being managed at this point. So there's a growing demand for, if we just do redevelopments, we redevelop these areas and we have management that comes into play when we redevelop. If we have less than 1% of new development versus existing development, it's going to take a long time to just do redevelopment. And that's assuming that 100% of new development today is actually infill development, right? Developing areas that are already developed. This means that we'll need to do retrofitting. We have these urban areas or these impervious areas that are not controlled. So we're seeing more and more of a of a need and a requirement to retrofit these urban areas, to manage areas, impervious areas that frankly just run off right directly into streams that aren't managed at all. That's going to be, and it's not an easy, not a cheap thing to do, but we're seeing more of a focus on that. So that's a significant driver, and we'll see more of that in the future. So I want to go back to this idea of a tipping point, and with the thought of looking at other sectors. One of the good things about being being relatively new is that you can look at other sectors and say, how did they develop? How did they change over time? And then we can borrow from them and say, maybe their ideas are things that we can use, or we can learn from lessons or mistakes that they've made in the past, as an example. So one thing we could look at is recycling, which may seem like it's not at all related to what we're talking about here, but it is in many ways. We have, so just thinking about recycling rates were pretty low, right? 1960 to 1985, we only saw, a 3.5% increase in recycling rates. Actually, nothing happened with recycling. But then there was this huge jump, 23% increase. Big jump after 1985. So we're looking at, the green line is total tons of municipal solid waste that's recycled. Recycling rate percentage-wise is this purple line. So the recycling rate goes up significantly and eventually flattens off by the 2009, 2010, that kind of. So what happened? Well, what happened was we started to consume more, and we started to throw more. We generated more waste. The amount of waste we generated went from almost 3 pounds per capita per day to 5 in 1970, over 50 years. That's an increase, but it's a pretty, that's only 0.05 pounds per capita per day per year. So that increase was relatively slow. Then you look at the increase between 1970 and 1980, we really started to increase. So we went to 3 pounds per capita per day per year. So we increased that much per year in just 10 years. So we just had a lot of trash. We had a lot of solid waste. So we generated more waste. We started to understand the challenges with open dumping when it comes to impacts to groundwater, other types of pollution, toxics, brownfields. So we started prohibiting open dumping, and we had more regulations on landfills, as we should. It's a public health issue. So that created this driver for recycling. And we also had understood that we just need to start collecting this stuff, and we can't just keep throwing stuff out, right? So that's one analog to look at. Keep that in mind. I'm going to come back to that. So we have to think about what are the drivers out there. So one of the drivers is shifting precipitation patterns. Some would call it climate change. Some would call it other things. I don't really care. We're seeing it in the data. So I don't want to get into a political discussion on this. It's happening. We're seeing it happen. We're measuring it better. We're measuring it more. And one kind of a data point in this context is Atlas 14, which is used to be known as TP40. Basically, it's the way that we estimate storm depths, right? So the 10-year, 24-hour storm is this depth, right? Well, there is a better way of doing this. Atlas 14 it's been around since 2004, so it's not that new, but they've made it better. They've made improvements through NOAA. And the problem is that we're doing this in a piecemeal fashion, right? State by state, maybe a couple of states together. The states have to pay for it. We haven't had federal funding. Our organization is actually advocating for this to be done across the country every 10 years. They just update all of our information because our precipitation patterns are shifting so greatly. You can look at Texas. They just updated theirs in 2019, I believe. They found that in Houston, their 100-year event, through statistical analysis, increased from 13 inches to 18 inches. And it wasn't just Hurricane Matthew that actually they did this work before Hurricane Matthew started or hit. But they're seeing this across the state. What was a 100-year before is now the 25-year event. Across much of the state, or most of the state, we're seeing precipitation patterns and depths increase. So that's just a snapshot. If we can do this across the whole country, then we can do this more efficiently. We can do this better. But this is the point, is that we're seeing this. There's a driver here. There's a reason that Texas spent the money to do this. Other states are doing this as well. But this is one of those drivers that's going to get us to that tipping point, or get us closer to that tipping point. And there's many drivers. I'm just highlighting a couple that I think are interesting. And one is source control. So we see trash. That's been around again for a long time. We talked about solid waste. But we're seeing there's more and more awareness of what's out there in terms of trash issues. I'll share some more information on that. But we're also seeing impacts on what's out there chemically. There's millions and millions of chemicals in our environment. We don't know how they interact with each other. We don't know how they interact with the environment. When they're studied in lab environments, not out in the environment. And I say the environment, the real world environment, out in the backyard kind of thing. So we're now starting to track this a little bit more. Copper and zinc are things that are part of there's a lot of copper brake pads. A lot of work's been done in Washington State and California to focus on that, to look at the impacts to fish in that context and other impacts. Now they have found ways to remove the copper from brake pads and replace it with something else that's less toxic or not as impactful. Same thing's happening with the level of zinc that's in tires. That's going on right now in some states about trying to remove that. Coal tar asphalt sealant, that's a coal tar sealant for asphalt. It's a carcinogen. There's been a lot of work on that. It's somewhat controversial. I don't think it really is. The data seems pretty clear, but there's several states that now ban coal tar. They use a different type of asphalt sealant that's less impactful, less toxic. It's safer. Something that's in the news a lot today is Pfas, PFOA, this family of chemicals that are out there. There's like nonstick pans and things like that. It's everywhere. It was created by 3M in my home state of Minnesota. So it's a big deal up there, but it's everywhere in the environment. You can find this in rain now. It's very ubiquitous, and at certain levels it's carcinogenic. Well, this is something that we're going to have to deal with in stormwater. So how are we going to treat it? The point is that we need to think about not just trying to treat our way out of issues, but reduce the amount of toxics in the environment, pollutants in the environment. Now, that, of course, is a long game. We need to do both. But we're starting to see more true source control. And the last example is 6-ppd, which is it's basically the part of the carbon part of tires. There's a lot of data that made the news, major news across the world about the level of impacts to and toxicity for fish species, not just super sensitive fish, but relatively tolerant fish species get impacted by 6-ppd. So now the U.S. tire industry and the internet and scrap tire industry, others are looking at what can we do to replace that. So this is another driver. I mentioned trash. 80% of all trash, the plastics that are in the ocean, come from land-based sources. So if you look at, we get 12.2 million tons per year of plastics in the marine environment, at least 9 tons of that come from these areas, urban areas, right? MS4s are part of this. They clog our conveyances, they get into our BMPs. And so that's a big part of it. Another thing, we look at microplastics, vehicle tire dust, right? This is from England, so that's why tire is spelled differently. But the tire dust is potentially 30% of the microplastics in the ocean, and that stuff is going to get into fish. It's going to be into what we eat, and again, at certain levels, it becomes carcinogenic. So you might think of microplastics as something that is different from trash on the street. They're related. They're related, and it's something that's not insignificant. California is starting to address this in a big way, but a lot of other states and a lot of other jurisdictions are starting to do it as well. Another driver is that, again, we've got this ability to manage stormwater in a smart way. So we're not just evolving as from gray to green, but I would say dumb or passive stormwater infrastructure to active stormwater or smart infrastructure, where we can take a pond that is just a hole in the ground with a riser structure, and we can start to make it smarter. We can put actuated valves on it. We can put dynamic controls on it to drain it out when it needs to be drained and let it fill in when it can be filled in. And I mean, there's so many places to go here. It's a whole lot of work that's going on. There's a guy named Bronco Kirkes at the University of Michigan has done a lot of great work that's making this a reality, highly sensorized or sensed watershed. So this is not just looking at one, but a series of watershed or series of BMPs or freshwater watersheds, as an example. So this is another driver. The point is we can do more. So we can and we should and we are. This makes it more valuable, these investments more valuable, and it's becoming more and more cost effective. So another driver is it worth it for green infrastructure or LID? We just did a study. We looked at 13 or 12 counties across the country. We need to do more, but this is a starting point. We basically said, if we put $1 million, for every dollar we put in of investment in green infrastructure, what do we get out of it? Take a look at economic return, tax revenues, economic activities, things like that. What we found is that we get $1.55 for every dollar we put in an investment. We also get 13 jobs for every $1 million that we invest. So how does that compare with others? In the drinking water, wastewater industry, they get about $2.26, 16 jobs per million. We're not at the same level. I also feel like we're probably not tracking this as well as they have, because they've been doing this for a long time. But the point is, this is a positive economic investment. The more we can get information on this that show that it's not just a burden, it's an investment. It's going to have a return on communities and local economies. Again, that is a driver. That's going to be a motivator for folks. So again, I'm going to go back to what I showed before. Are we making progress in our stormwater our MS4 national MS4 program? Again, I'm highlighting the fact that we don't have consensus here. And I talked about the National Academy of Science report early on. And here's a quote that kind of captures it. It says that basically the way that we're regulating today is unlikely to produce an accurate, complete picture of the extent of the problem and not likely to control stormwater's contribution to water quality or water body impairment. So the way we're doing things is not getting us there. That was something that was, this is from a quote from over 10 years ago. So, okay, so what are we doing about it? And then I'll wrap up. My organization, our organization, one thing we're doing is we've set up a National Center of Excellence on stormwater testing. So we're starting to do a national program to test and verify, not certify, but test and verify proprietary products, but we're going to get to public domain products eventually as well. But we're starting with proprietary products. Basically, someone comes to you with a new program or a new product, and they say, "Are we?" Here I get 80% TSS removal, or I get 60% phosphorus removal. We're setting up a program right now to be able to say, "Here, we're going to test it, and we're going to show that that's true, or we're going to show that it's not, based upon standardized testing. So the point is that we need to understand performance better in our sector and in our technologies. One way we're doing that is through the establishment of an Asdm committee. This was just established this year. Asdm Committee on Stormwater Control Measures. It's Committee E64. Would love for anybody to join. Check this out if you can. $75 a year to join Asdm and be part of this committee. Basically, this is a way to set up whatever standards we need to, testing standards, performance standards, construction standards, specifications, best practices. We're just getting going, and there's a lot of work to do, a lot of work that we're already doing right now. But this is something that can help us, again, in that sector maturation, looking at industry standards. What else are we doing? We're looking at ways to invest better, and I'll talk about this more tomorrow when I talk about funding and financing and project delivery. But there's an approach that I'll talk about tomorrow. This is called the community-based public-private partnership, or CBP3 approach. And this is a way to get the private sector involved, to make our investments more efficient in green infrastructure and low-impact development, and to maximize the benefits to communities, local communities, through local jobs, local small businesses, others who benefit from stormwater investments. We got some grant money, and we're working with over 100 communities across 12 different regions across the country, from Puerto Rico all the way to Hawaii and all these places in between, including Oklahoma, Louisiana, and other places. So we are moving forward on this and working with them to see if they can use this new approach. It was developed by EPA, and it's actually been implemented for several years, and about 4 or 5 communities across the country already seeing major, significant cost savings and significant social and economic benefits locally. More to be said, but if you want to learn more, there's a link there on that. But that's where we're trying to show leadership. And I'll just say this as I get close to wrapping up here, that folks may oftentimes I give talks like these, and people may wonder, why should I get involved with anything at the national level? I've got my local program to focus on, and I appreciate that, and that's where everything happens, really. What I'm trying to do is roll information up at the national level to be able to advocate better for local programs, but it goes both ways. Folks at the local level, really, it'd be beneficial if you understood what was going at the national level. I've got some information that's highlighted here about 6 PPD, as I mentioned before. That this made The Guardian, New York Times, CNN, other, Scientific American, and all this kind of things that showed this information. It's out in the world about how toxic some of this stuff is, and that's in our sector. It's in our world. It's going to be something that we're going to have to be dealing with. We try to collect this information and disseminate it out to the sector so folks can learn about it. So you can be part of that conversation, keep up with the current events. Also, there's a lot of learning going on, a lot of new programs. Again, we're still relatively new, so like I said, I talked about Montana. I've been connecting Montana up with folks in Eastern Washington as well as Nebraska. They're learning from each other and how the programs work and how what they can do in their regions, because they're similar climatologically. So this peer-to-peer exchange is highly valuable. This is a way to get involved. You can also get engaged with national organizations. Again, I talked about we get involved with ASFPM and ASCE and others. But I think the biggest takeaway is the fact that it's such a young sector that we can have. We've actually not been at this too long, and we're pretty under. We don't have a whole lot of funding and resources, but we've been making some significant impacts on the sector. So one of the benefits of being a young sector is that you can have significant impacts on it in the early days, and that's where we are, relatively speaking, in my view. I don't think we're at that tipping point yet. So anyways, as a summary, again, we've been at the kids' table for a long time. We've been at this for a long time. We've been at the kids' table for a long time, but I think this is changing. Low impact development, green infrastructure really is helping to make that change. We're showing that it's better value, it brings more value, it's better value, there's more awareness, it's becoming less of just a niche thing and becoming more seen as a mainstream way of addressing urban runoff. We do have many needs in the sector today, but shifts are happening. We are trying to show that there's a need for this. The more that we can advocate to the federal government and to others that we need support to meet these needs, the better response that we're getting. And there are data points that I can talk about. that show that this is starting to happen. It's going to take a while. This stuff doesn't happen overnight. Again, I'm thinking about where are we in the continuum. I think we have not reached our tipping point yet, at least overall, not nationally. But we do have drivers that are going that way, as we talked about. Precipitation patterns are shifting. We're showing that there's needs for changes in our regulatory program, and we're seeing an economic return. Like I said, green infrastructure and LID practices have positive economic value, so it's worth the investment. Technology is going to play a role, has played a role. It's going to play even more of a role in the future. That's not going away. That's only to accelerate. And last point, as a plug for my organization, we're engaged now, and we will be in the future as we move along. So that's all I have on my side. I can't really hear what's in the room right now, so I don't know if there are any questions or not to address at this time.
Thanks, Seth. Thanks for that very engaging, interesting presentation. So I invite anyone from the audience and from Zoom to share some questions, pose some questions to Seth. Please just come up here to the microphone. Any volunteers? Don, you're welcome.
I was wondering of the infrastructure that's in limbo right now, if a proportionate amount of that is actually helping to address these issues, or if that's just going to help accelerate infrastructure development of a similar nature of what's been done in the past to make the problem even worse.
Can you clarify, when you say the infrastructure that's in place today, can you elaborate a little bit more? Sorry to.
I'm talking about the bill that the House has passed that's tied to the other.
Yeah.
And so what's wrapped up in that spin bill, is it actually appropriately addressing these topics, or is it just going to exacerbate?
Yeah, no, I have information that I was going to cover tomorrow on that, but what I understand what's in the infrastructure bill right now is, so I've been at this at the national level for 11, 12 years, something like that, and I've worked on the Hill. I'm not a lobbyist, but I work with lobbyists who track this stuff in a better way than I do. But I keep my finger on the pulse of things. Again, I go down and meet with folks pretty regularly. It's part of the kind of the business of what I'm doing. And what I understand right now is that, well, I'll just say this: the version of the bill that went to the House that we last saw had more stormwater investments in it than anything else I've ever seen up to this point combined. It's significant. I think it's over I estimated $2.3 billion over 5 years focused on stormwater. So, and that's just the stuff that's focused specifically on stormwater in the way that we're talking about it. There's more of a focus on resilience that goes beyond this as well. So I think I don't know where we're going to end up on the other side, frankly. I'm not sure, and hopefully we'll find out at some point in the near future. But I think that an example well, I'll just give two quick examples. There's something called the Overflow and Sewer Grants Program, OSG program. You guys will probably hear more about that if you already haven't at this point. It's got a longer title, and it's got the phrase stormwater reuse in there, but it's not just stormwater reuse, it's stormwater writ large. And sewer SSOs and CSOs. So it's funding for CSOs, SSOs, and stormwater programs, basically. And it's one of these things. It's a grant program. It's allocated out to states using some formula that we disagreed with, frankly. But that's a whole other point of discussion. But it's still, money's money, and any money is better than what we have today. So that right now it's funded. Actually, it was created in 2018 as part of, it was in 2018 legislation, and it just got funded this year. Takes a year or two for that stuff to get set up. Right now it's at $67 million for the whole country. Not a whole lot when you slice that up 50 different ways, right? But they're talking about ramping that up. At one point, it was close to $400 million per year. So it's a huge increase. Now I think it's back to $280 million per year. But that's still, an increase of, what is that for, right? 4 times the amount per year, just for this one program. So And these are grants. This is not a loan program. This is just straight up grants, goes out to the states, and the states can do with it what they want, obviously. But that's one example, and that's in the infrastructure bill. I've heard that that's not been touched at this point. So hopefully that's actually going to happen. That's going to be money for stormwater programs and overflow programs across the country. So that's it's one example of a positive, and I think this is going to be something directly beneficial. I could also mention ARPA. I think there might have been already some discussion about ARPA. The reinvestment act that went through that provided a lot of funding to localities. I know that is an example, but it could Kentucky use that money, some ARPA money, for to address localized flooding issues. So stormwater is a qualified investment under ARPA, as an example. But the other thing I wanted to mention about the infrastructure bill is that there's a call for the creation of centers of excellence around the country for stormwater. And I talked about centers of excellence. That's our organization. This would be federal, centers of excellence. Up to 5 of them, $1 million per year for 5 years. So that's $25 million over 5 years. So that it's really good, because then we can have research and focus on issues at a regional level, not just at a national level, which is really what we need to do. So that's a positive thing. And what I've heard is that's not been touched. So I'll just say this, that I think that what's in the infrastructure bill, assuming it moves forward and assuming that it looks something similar to what we've seen about a month ago, or at least a couple of weeks ago, that should be a positive thing for stormwater. And I think it's going to be, again, it could be one of those tipping points. We might see a shift in paradigm on support for stormwater. And they're even talking about things like creating a new construction grants program for stormwater. That's not part of this bill, but there's discussion about that happening maybe in the future. So this might be a way to kick us into that higher level of support, which is frankly what we need to really make some significant changes at the local level. So I don't know if I addressed the question, but those are the thoughts that came to mind.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Seth, I really liked your comparison to the recycling history that we have. I wanted to hear your thoughts, if you've done the research, on what did they do well during that time in the 90s to kind of get to that tipping point, and what can we learn and kind of mirror as we try to get to the tipping point with low impact development?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think, and I don't have a significant understanding of all of this compared to others in the sector, but I think there was just the big driver was, or what did they do? I think that there was just, you saw more awareness of it, right? So I think about, and I'm going to date myself here, those commercials, this was back in the 70s, right? Keep America Beautiful and all this stuff, when it was the Native American that was crying. That's kind of the thing that people of my age or older can remember that situation. And I think it was those types of outreach, engagement, public awareness, those type of things, I think, is what drove this. That, in that context, trash is bad. We need to do something about it. It's up to us as individuals, right? We need to start, cleaning up ourselves. I think that instilled, as a growth of that was, hey, one other thing we can do is not just not throw things out, but now we can go one step further and we can throw things in a recycling bin. So I think it's public awareness. I think it was one of the things that they did really well. Of course, that was back in the time when we had 3 major, television channels, right? It was a lot easier to get messages out that way, I believe. But I think it was just that messaging and consistent messaging about this helped. So that's on the public awareness track. But I think on the ground, again, there were just real challenges. There was landfills and that were reaching their limits, frankly. There were other regulations making it harder to do open dumping, like I said before. So there was a kind of a real practical challenge, and then there was the perception was changing too. So I think that if we can do that in our structure, or our sector for LID and green infrastructure, then we can start to change this. I think even 5-10 years ago, there's one thing I didn't include in here, which is a survey from the National Home Builders, which I think was really telling. And they said, basically the question that someone has posed is, if green infrastructure and low impact development is so great, why doesn't it just happen? Why doesn't the market just take care of it, right? It's got all this value, and it's so beneficial, because oftentimes you can actually show that's cheaper. Oftentimes, if you do new development, if you use green infrastructure, for instance, you need less gray infrastructure, right? If that's the case, then why isn't it just happening, right? Well, there are barriers in reality, and this survey from the National Home Builders showed that there's a lot of perceptions. There's perceived increase, higher cost, and sometimes there is, but there's an assumption or a presumption, or a perception that doing something that's greener is just going to be, it's going to be more difficult, it's going to be more costly, it's going to be all these other things. There's a status quo and perception thing, and I think that was more prevalent 10 years ago, frankly. We think about low impact development, that term, as far as I understand it, was really used for the first time, I think, again, out in Prince George's County. It's right across the river from where I am right now, by a guy named Larry Kaufman, whose background is in landscape architecture, or wasn't civil engineering, but he had an appreciation of vegetative controls and whatnot. I think he was also an engineer as well. But anyway, the point is, that was back in 1999. I was working on stuff with Prince George's County and others back in 1999, or late, even earlier, 1998. It's taken this long to get to this point, but back then it was seen as a bizarre thing. 10 years ago, it was still seen as kind of an oddity, and it's still the exception today, not the rule. But I think this perception is starting to shift, and that's part of that tipping point. So I think, to answer your question, I think the more that we talk about the value of it, we talk about, we get more data about, does it actually perform, and how does it perform? Does it perform well? If we can get that out there, so it does perform well, and also to talk about the value of it. So as long as we get more of this information out there, we're going to have these shifts in perceptions. So perceptions will not be against green just because it's green. It's going to be, hey, no, we appreciate it and we want to start using it. And there are a number of land developers who say, hey, we want to do this because we've done this in our recent land development projects, and they were really beneficial. We had a good experience. And now we know how to do it better too. We learned some things, and now we're getting better. So I think it's this whole thing about we're getting better at designing it, getting better at building it. There's still a lot of problems, and it's still, we're still young. But the more we can get experience, the more it becomes a standardized thing, and the more that we can see the value of it and not see it as a unicorn or a thing that's really hard to do. All of those perceptions are shifting, and as that continues to shift, I think that will change things. And that's what we saw, I think, in the recycling world too, is that it's, at first, boy, I had to drive my stuff to a recycling center. That's a pain. But now I have just one big recycling bin. I can just throw all my stuff in there. I don't have to separate it out, single stream. That makes it a lot easier. We've reduced barriers in recycling. We need to reduce barriers for low impact development.
Thanks for those questions and responses. I think, thinking about the evaluation and that tipping point, one of the things that I really appreciate, Seth, in your response is that I think we have to revalue some of these assets and resources, not just look at them as a liability in some cases, which often certain green infrastructure becomes a liability, but actually looking at it as an asset. And that means awareness raising, improving awareness of the watershed, the resource that's available. And you'll hear a little bit more about that in our further discussion after lunch. So we're out of time for questions. Seth, I really want to thank you. Maybe a round of applause.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it. I appreciate that. I'm going to stop sharing now.
And we'll have an opportunity to talk with Seth again tomorrow afternoon, so you can certainly save some of the questions if we didn't get to you.